Welcome, everyone. Very excited to be here and happy to share my knowledge. Before we kick off into the talk, I want to talk a little bit about logistics. So at the bottom of the slides, I will always have a link to Slido here. And there's a sort of hashtag code there that you can enter, and you'll be able to enter questions throughout the talk. And then at the end of the sort of slides, I'll sort of have hopefully time to answer one or two, hopefully maybe more questions. You can upvote questions so that we can focus on all of that. And then at the end of the talk, we'll be going back into the Slack channel and the Teams channel after that. But for the talk itself, that will also be recorded. I'll make sure that I get to these questions so you can do this asynchronously. Obviously, in this new distributed world, it's a little bit harder to sort of get that sort of feedback that you might get in a real conference, in-person conference, but I hope that you'll be able to get some of your questions answered. A little bit about myself. I've been working in technology for about 20 years. So I've done everything from being a developer to sort of a tech leader to architect to sort of consultant and a CTO. And one of my passions is really about this talk, which is around technical leadership. And this is really around the book, Talking with Tech Leads. I've spent a lot of time helping other people go on that journey to become a technical leader. And it's a challenging one because a lot of businesses or organizations don't provide people with that support. So thank you very much for coming along, and I hope you learn a lot about this journey. We'll cover a number of different elements. I also run a free newsletter for technical leaders. It comes out weekly, and it talks about things I'm reading around leadership, technical topics, and processes in organizations. And I also run an online workshop that's also available. But let's jump straight into the talk, and let's talk about what we're actually going to be covering. So the first thing I want to talk about is really this archetypical journey. So how do people find themselves in this role of a tech lead? We're then going to have a look at what is meant by this role of a tech lead. We have many different definitions. We have a lot of inconsistency. Naming is really a hard problem, so we're going to try to tackle that question. And then I'm going to look at some of the surprises and struggles that particularly new tech leaders will find themselves in when they transition into this role for the first time. And then finally, we'll talk about what I think are some of the tools that you can use to become a really great tech lead. So these are some of the things that we're going to cover. And along the way, we're going to look at 5 different lessons learned that hopefully you can take away and use immediately on your own journey. So let's start. Let's talk about the typical journey of a tech lead. Now, they wouldn't really be a tech lead if they weren't technical. So most technical leaders start off being a type of developer or a technical skill. Now, over time, you're obviously building sort of software, growing your skills, and there are kind of 2 different sort of questions that a lot of people find themselves in when they go on this journey. One of them is, I really want to be promoted. I want a new challenge. I want to have a growth opportunity. I want more responsibility. And this is definitely one of the other paths. The second path is when other people in your sort of organization or your business look at you and perhaps go, you're ready for a stretch opportunity. Like, you may not think you're ready, but we think that you're ready to be promoted, and we'd like you to try out this role as a tech lead. So a lot of people think, now I have this role, I am a tech lead. People think that this is a step up in the ladder. And I really want you to not think about that. So this is the sort of wrong mental model to approach this, and we'll come back to this idea. But let's say that you have this new role, and we've got this role represented by a little badge. You've now sort of transitioned from being just a developer, perhaps, to now being a tech lead. What do you do differently? And this is the ultimate question. Now, a lot of the time people assume that you know what to do because they assume you understand what the scope of this role is. But the challenge that a lot of people have when they find themselves in this role for the first time is that it's different in every team and it's different in every organization. And so the expectations are very, very different. So the first lesson is really that recognizing that the tech lead role is not a promotion, it's a role change. And therefore the things that you do, the activities that you take care of and the responsibilities you need to be accountable for are very different from being a developer. It's not just simply more of that, which is what a lot of people fall into. So let's go back to this idea of this role as a promotion. Now, if you think about promotions and career ladders, you typically have something like this in a lot of organizations which sort of map out these different roles at different levels, talk about the behavior and the expected impact of that role. Now, for a lot of people in software, you typically start off being maybe a junior software engineer. As you get more experience, you become more independent. You can sort of build software without as much support. You become a software engineer. Perhaps you're starting to influence system design, or you're taking care of some small microservices. You become a bit more of a senior software engineer. Now, a lot of people have this mental model. The tech lead is simply an evolution of this, which is really more of what a senior software engineer does. But this is the false understanding of what this role is. Now, the reason for this is, there's often a talk about these different development tracks in a lot of organizations. So in one sort of organization, they might talk about the individual contributor track. And this is typically what you think of as a software engineer. And you have kind of like a management track, which is perhaps what you think of classically around perhaps engineering managers. I like to describe evolution as a ternary track, so a trident model of career development. And the reason for this is each of these different sort of paths has a different scope and different responsibilities. So we have a technical leadership path, an individual contributor path, and a management path. Now, if we think about sort of the Pareto principle, 80% of your time, 70 to 80% of your time, what do you do for most of it? For an individual contributor, you're spending most of your time working by yourself. So executing or doing, right? So this is what a lot of developers think about, which when they say, I want to be coding, I want to write code. So some of the activities that somebody who was an individual contributor might be doing is designing software. They might be testing and validating that their software is working. And of course, from a software development perspective, actually building software. So that takes up a majority of their time. If you're in the management track, I often talk about good managers spend a lot of their time managing the system in which people are working. So they're not necessarily managing individuals, but managing the work environment that needs sort of taken care of in order to get things done. So in a lot of organizations, this might be sort of planning, communication with other teams, coordinating. It might be about supporting your team, helping unblock the things your team needs in order to get things done. Think about environments that you're waiting for or a dependency from another team. It's often about sort of budgeting as well in terms of trying to make sure that budgets sort of plan out in terms of the sort of normal processes. But the technical leader track, if I think about sort of the majority of their time, they spend a lot of their time leading technical topics. And what do I mean by this? Some of the activities here are about aligning a team. So one of the common activities a technical leader might need to take up is trying to get agreement within the team about perhaps which direction they're actually heading. So be it, React versus Angular or Vue.js, making sure that there's agreement and alignment across that team. Perhaps it's about setting a technical vision about where the team needs to get to. Maybe you're going on that journey from monolith to microservices, and that technical vision is also mapping out how you're going to actually get there. Perhaps it's making sure that there's enough sort of management around technical debt. So convincing product owners that now is the time to invest in the right level of that. And obviously trying to manage technical risks around trying to make sure that the software that you're building is reliable, scales, and will meet the quality that is needed for that particular domain that you're actually building software for. And obviously knowledge sharing about making sure that there's no sort of silos of knowledge. So this takes up a lot of time, and you'll notice a lot of these activities aren't necessarily about them writing code as much as an individual developer. And so this is a fundamentally different skill set. So a top tip for you going on this journey or thinking about this is recognizing what got you here won't get you there. The skills you developed as a developer won't necessarily prepare you effectively to take care of all the different tasks that you need to take care of if you're going to be an effective tech lead. So we've looked at the archetypical story about people finding themselves suddenly in this role and not realizing what they have to do is actually quite different. Let's go into a little bit more depth about what I mean by a tech lead. So the tech lead role, I think, is a software engineer that is responsible for leading a development team and also responsible for the quality of its technical deliverables. So unlike a perhaps product manager who is responsible perhaps for the product roadmap and priorities in terms of what you focus on for customers, a tech lead needs to be a lot more inward focused to make sure that the system that you're building and that everyone is contributing to can continue to be evolved over time. So that's really what I mean about the quality of the technical deliverables. But also, you don't really have a team if people aren't working well together. So you can have a group of individuals, each writing their own sort of code, but you don't really have a strong team if they're not really working well together. And that really requires a lot of stewardship, which is what this tech lead role is responsible for. In terms of the overlap of skills, this is the mental model I encourage you to adopt of a good balance between three major areas. So one of these areas is naturally around development, right? So a tech lead can't be effective unless they understand the choices and the technology that their team is using. So you can't lead technical topics if you don't have that background. But it doesn't mean that you need to be the uber expert in every area. That will be impossible because you can't just be an expert in every single area. And so this tech lead role needs a balance of enough development skills to be able to lead technical topics and have respect from the team. But they also need a good balance of architecture skills and leadership skills. So architecture skills in terms of not just writing about code, but really thinking about the whole environment and building systems that work well with each other, which includes people and process in your organization, be it your people who operate the software or people who customer services to make sure that they can use the software and support customers using that software. And of course, a key element of a tech lead is that leadership skill area of really making sure that you build a strong team around making sure that there is a common agreed decision to make sure that everyone is moving towards that same area. And so a tech lead isn't going to be an expert in one of these areas. What they need is enough expertise in all of these areas and a balance, and that's a really key message. So lesson 2 is the tech lead role requires effective leadership skills, and you may not have been given the support in your organization to build those skills. A good mental model I like to think of is, let's say that you're playing an RPG, a role-playing game. What's very typical in an RPG is you gain experience and you can allocate experience points to different traits. And in a game, you might choose a specialist of some sort. But from a tech lead perspective, what's really key is you need to be well-rounded. So you can't just be single aspect focused. You really have to have a good balance. And so a lot of the things that you'd be gaining experience points in will naturally be development skills as a developer. And perhaps you've built a little bit of systems or you've had more responsibility, so you've built some architecture skill, but a tech lead needs to have a broader set of experience around that. Similarly, you may have had some informal experience leading perhaps in your own sort of social sort of world or in many opportunities, but you may not have built enough leadership skills or experience to be comfortable with that, which is essential for this role. And so what you have here is an imbalance in where your skills have been allocated, and to be effective, you need to readdress that balance. So what this means is if you're going on this journey to become an effective tech lead, you focus probably most of your personal development on this development circle. And this is fantastic that you're here in this talk, because the key message for you is to make sure that you start to focus on areas which you've probably not focused on in the past. And this is really around both leadership skills and architecture skills. When I think about leadership, one of the sort of good mental models I have is when you have a team of individuals that are working in their own choice, in their own directions, if you add up their sort of vectors, what you'll end up with is a sort of maybe increase, but a lot of people will be working against each other as individuals. And so a good leader, well, this is what ineffective leadership looks like. A good leader is thinking about making sure that you're aligning people as much as possible. And so this is really about that decision making, around making sure that there's a clear technical vision to make sure everyone's moving in the same direction, so that when you add up all people's efforts, they're not sort of undoing each other's work or fighting against each other, but the team moves a lot further overall. Now, what does this look like for a tech lead? This is really thinking as if your code base was written by a single person. Now, it'll never look exactly like it was written by a single person, but it's a nice, simple test. Can you open up parts of the code base and you can tell who wrote that part of the code base? If you can tell, then you're probably leading a group of people, but not really leading a team. If you're leading a team, then what you should have is an agreed standard or agreement with your team about which patterns that you use, which code styles do you choose, and how do you sort of approach the most common problems? Do you have 4 persistence frameworks? Do you have 3 different ways you throw exceptions or errors and handle them? Each of these require an agreement with the team, which is a key part of technical leadership. So think about this as a simple way to say, are you doing a good job? By thinking about how well your code base looks overall from each person. Now, a common question that I get from a lot of people is, you have this person that isn't coding as much as a developer, but they still need to be, knowing the technology. What's a good amount of time that they spend with code? So my rule of thumb here is really a sort of 30% rule, or at least a minimum of 30% of time with a team. Now, I say this because, you can't have 0% of time without understanding how that system is evolving. If you have a big team, your code is going to continue evolving and changing, and assumptions that somebody might be having about that system are going to change really rapidly. And so you need to have some involvement with the code to understand how it's evolving over time. At the same time, if you're spending as much time as a developer writing code, let's say you're spending 70 or 80% of your time designing and coding, you're not taking care of a whole bunch of responsibilities, and probably nobody is going to take care of them as a result. And so there's a lot of things that will sort of be unaddressed until it's too late. So be it until you have an incident when people haven't really built enough sort of stability or resilience into their code. Perhaps it's about technical debt, where everything just gets slower and slower over time because people are really frustrated by how hard it is to make new changes. Somebody, and that somebody is the tech lead, needs to make sure that those topics are being addressed, and that takes time away from the code. So you'll never spend as much time as you would as a developer because the value you add is different. At the same time, you do need to spend some time, and one of the heuristics is thinking about this over an average time frame. There will be periods where you get pulled away from the code, be it your planning phase or a project initiation phase, where you might spend maybe 2 or 3 weeks in lots of meetings. It's a very common thing for this role. What that's telling you is you need to come back to a balance and say, okay, I've spent a lot of time away from the code. I need to understand how things have evolved, right? To understand where that risk lies. And so the next weeks after that, you might spend more time with the team in code to understand how that happens. And it doesn't mean you have to write code. You can do a lot more code reviews and reading code to get a sense of how things are evolving as well. So how to shift this idea of being an individual contributor to being a real technical leader? The first thing is awareness, which is great because you're all here. So now you probably need to address where you've invested your personal development to come up with a good balance. The next thing is to find training around areas that you could improve on. It's often useful to get feedback. So find somebody who can give you advice or feedback about how you're actually doing. And then also to make sure you deliberately practice. So like you might do code cards as a developer, you also need to focus on finding opportunities to practice this so you can see yourself sort of improving over time as well. Now, particularly around leadership, there are many different skills out there that you can sort of focus on, and there are many great resources around each of these areas. The hard part will be making a choice about where you should invest in to have the most impact, and that will be highly independent. But the good thing is that there are many different things out there depending on what you'd actually like to improve on. And so, there's many great business books around leadership. There's many great training courses around leadership. These are some of my favorite books around what I think are essential skills or essential topics that are really great value if you're looking at building some of the skills that these books address. But of course, make sure that you find opportunities to put this into practice and actually develop those skills as well. I really love this quote. So reading is still the main way that I both learn new things and to test my understanding. And this is from a technologist who has been a very accomplished leader. This is actually from Bill Gates. So, he's obviously developing his experience. And, one of the things that I learned about reading books is that you get access to so much expertise remotely that you don't have to be in person, which is very applicable in our current time as well. So make sure that you find a skill that you want to learn and find a book that's actually going to address that and start your journey in developing that skill. So lesson 3 is benefit from the many resources that are out there about leadership, but make sure to practice. So, just like anything, it's very easy to read something and then forget about it. And you never develop skill or competence if you don't actually put that into practice. In order to develop a skill, like you do in a role-playing game, you need to go through experience. You need to practice it often. And this is a really key lesson in developing leadership skills in particular. So we looked at this story about how people find themselves in this role. We've looked at what is this tech lead. Let's cover the surprises and struggles. And we'll cover in particular 3 surprises and struggles that are very common for people on this journey. If you've played this role before, hopefully you recognize some of these things. If you haven't played this role yet, you can prepare yourself to understand what these are. So the first one you might notice is depicted by a lot of people in a corner and perhaps one person on the side. And this is really about the feeling of loneliness, right? So as a tech lead, there's typically only one of you on a team. And that's very different from when you were a developer, when you have a lot of developers on a team. And so you get a certain sense of this sort of outsider perspective, or you feel like an outsider. Once you were sort of part of that sort of team, suddenly you're feeling outside. Now, if you've been a developer and you've been promoted into a tech lead role, you sort of recognize this because you recognize your relationship with your friends or your peers has changed a little bit. And that's quite natural because it is a different role. You'll be involved in different conversations. You'll have access to different information that will make you feel a little bit more alone. And a natural part of this role is also trying to work out, the right level of being, the right level of information teams need to know. There can be too much information that you can distract your team. So one side, you're trying to sort of protect them from distractions, things that are uncertain, things that will change so they can focus on getting things done. But at the same time, you're also trying to make sure that they have the right context so they can make good decisions. And having access to that and making those decisions will simply make you feel lonely. So it's just a natural part of the role. And everyone goes through this on this journey. The second surprise and struggle that a lot of people have is depicted by this diagram with lots of different arrows. And what I mean by this is dealing with uncertainty, right? So one of the hard things for a lot of people moving into this role is, as an engineer, we like to have right answers. Like, what's the correct answer, right? Tell me what's the right solution. And the hard thing about leading and with people is that there's often not a right answer. Right? So sometimes there's a good enough answer for now based on our information, but the information that we have will hopefully change over time as well. And this is kind of hard to kick because as a developer, we're used to this kind of binary world, right? So we have tests that go red that tell us things are not working, and then go green when they tell us things are working. We have builds or continuous integration builds that tell us, our system is not working or is working. You have computers that, stop working or they turn on. So we're used to this kind of binary world. But unfortunately, once again, when leading people and teams, you're making a judgment call. And judgment calls don't necessarily have a right answer. They have to balance a number of different qualities to come up with a good enough answer. And that's something that you'll have to accept when you're moving into something like this role as well. And once again, information that you have is going to be imperfect. It takes time to collect information, be it asking everyone's opinion on a team. And by the time that you actually, get to the last person of the team, people that you maybe spoke to first have maybe changed their mind. So you're always dealing with imperfect information, which means you can never come up with the perfect answer. So the third surprise and struggle that everyone goes through on this journey is depicted by this snowflake. and perhaps you might understand this, is that people are puzzling. So people are unique, and that's why I've depicted them as a sort of snowflake here. Everyone has their different preferences. Everyone has a different stage of their life that they're going through. People will have different maybe communication preferences about how they'd like to receive information or how much they'd like to be involved. And the myriad of people that you'll deal with will be countless, that it'll always be very surprising. The great thing about this is you can focus on understanding people's strengths to recognize where people where their strengths can be applied and be useful to your team. And it's useful to build patterns or archetypes. So try not to stereotype, which is pretending how you think somebody is going to react, because you don't ever know. People are unique. But you might start to recognize some patterns that might prepare you for different scenarios to make sure at least you cover a majority of perhaps communication preferences, or at least recognize how people would like to work in different styles as well. And you'll build up your portfolio of archetypes as you gain more experience as well. So these three surprises and struggles are very common, and it is just part of naturally going on this journey as a technical leader. My lesson 4 here for you is taking comfort that others have already been on this journey. So you don't have to be the person who feels like you might be alone, because you have access to other people who've been on this journey before. So to address this, my best tip for a lot of people going into this role is building your support structure. So if you're in a bigger company, you probably have other tech leads of other teams that you can probably reach out to. Maybe you have somebody who you've worked with before that you can reach out to and ask them to mentor you. But make sure that you actually have somebody that you can talk to. They won't exactly understand your same circumstance, but you'll have a sort of shoulder to cry on, or an ear to bounce ideas off, or ideas to sort of ask how they might approach different situations that will help you deal with these surprises and struggles. Once again, nobody is going to be perfect. Everyone will have a different style, but it'll help you feel a lot more supported to take care of these surprises and struggles. So we've looked at surprises and struggles. Let's look at a couple of tips that I think will help you be a really great tech lead. My first tip is really focusing on developing others. A lot of people think, my role as a technical leader is continue to developing code, to work as a developer. But you have the best opportunity if you actually focus on developing your team so that your team has better capabilities. And a typical way that a lot of people think about this is falling into this sort of trap of being, telling people what to do or delegating immediately. And you might notice that this is that sort of binary trap once again, which is a mode of either or. And as a leader, you'll have to start to break that. And so it needs to be a little bit more refined. One of my favorite models for this is the situational leadership model. And it talks about in a different situation, you will choose a different mode of leadership. Right? And the goal here is to get to a point where you can delegate something to other people. But one of the fears of complete delegation is the fear that every sort of developer has, is that it's never going to be the same quality as what I would produce. And so you don't necessarily go directly to delegation, and you don't necessarily say, here is exactly how you have to do things. You might need to actually build up that skill and experience so you get comfortable based on that situation. One of the modes in there is that you might need to sell an opportunity to people, right? So you probably get this with senior engineers, is that you don't need to tell them what to do because they're competent at building systems, but maybe they don't really want to take care of a particular task. They don't understand how it adds value or how it's an opportunity for them to grow. And so a mode that you might need to take in is actually selling the opportunity for them, about helping them see where they can actually grow and also take on more responsibility as well. Another mode of leadership here is perhaps participating. Let's say that you have an incident outage, it's super complex. You can't delegate that immediately because maybe you don't know or you don't trust one person to take care of it because there are so many people involved. This is a mode where you probably need to take part with your team to understand what's causing the incident, how to triage this, how to restore service immediately, and make sure that you get the mode and grow people. But the key part here is really making sure that you start to continue to shift more responsibility to other people so that you get time back, but also they have opportunities to grow. And the situational leadership model talks about three elements to think about. Think about their skill, right? Think about their motivation, and also think about their urgency. And then depending on that situation, you might adopt a different type of interaction mode. The other sort of tool that I would offer you is really focusing on diversity. And what I mean by this is focusing on the different strengths that your team has. The BCG did an amazing research a couple of years ago around understanding the role diversity has in strong organizations. They actually looked at 6 different elements that contributed to innovation revenue, so products that built new business effectively. And they noticed that, or their research found that there's 4 of these were correlated. So higher levels of diversity in 4 of these elements was strongly correlated with higher levels of innovation revenue. And this means that it's a really great opportunity because the more diversity we have, the more broadly we can tackle different types of situations and different problems as the environment changes around us. One of my favorite quotes around this that I love is that nobody is perfect. We all have our strengths, but because we have our strengths, we also have our gaps or our weaknesses. But working as a team, nobody is perfect, but a team can be. Because when you have a whole bunch of people that are working together, our gaps and our strengths can overlap, which means the team as a whole can use the strengths of people in the appropriate situations where it makes sense, and other people can sort of take a step back where it's maybe not their strengths or it's their weaknesses. So we don't have to work on developing our weaknesses as long as we're working with people who have complementary strengths, which is one of the reasons why diverse teams and organizations work so well. One of my favorite books around this is the Strengths Finder book. It's run by the Gallup organization, or published by people from the Gallup organization. And they asked the question, what made people successful in their roles? They cataloged about 34 different strengths, and they noticed that people focused on their strengths in order to be successful in whatever roles they had, and partnered or built teams who had complementary strengths. So if you look at doing this book, you'll sort of get your top 5 strengths and then recognize perhaps the strengths that you don't have and seek out people who have different strengths. And as a tech lead, what's really useful about this book is having a vocabulary around identifying these traits and recognizing where they make a lot of sense. One of the examples from the book is the achiever strength. So, we need people who can get things done, because if we don't have anybody with an achievement strength, you won't really complete things. But at the same time, one of the other strengths in the book is called strategic. And it's not really great to have a whole team of just achievers, because maybe you'll get a lot of things done, but maybe you'll get a lot of the wrong things done. So you also need people who have that strategic strength to make sure it's moving in the right direction that your organization or team is going. And so that book gives you a good vocabulary and a way to have a conversation with your team to identify where your team's strengths collectively are, and also perhaps where your gaps are as well. So lesson 5 is really about making this move from what I call maker to multiplier mode. One of the biggest challenges for a lot of people going on this journey is this sort of trap of falling into this individual contributor mode where I see my value as the things that I have personally produced. And this is really about that individual contributor track, or that maker mode. And in order to be very successful as a technical leader, you really need to focus on this multiplier mindset, right? So as you delegate work or as you grow other people, then they're going to grow and your team is going to be able to deal with things a lot more effectively. If you're building and taking advantage of all the diverse strengths in your team will be able to do much more than what you possibly can. And if you help each one of those grow, then your team as a whole will be much more resilient and much more competent than what you possibly could have been. And so one of the biggest shifts here is really taking this mindset shift and making a move from maker to multiplier mode. So we've gone on this very quick journey today. We've had a look at how people fall into this role as a tech lead. We've looked at what is this tech lead role? What do we mean by this in different sort of circumstances? We've looked at 3 common surprises and struggles, and we've looked at a couple of different tips to be a really great tech lead and really about this shift. So as a reminder, the keys to growing to be effective in this role are really making sure that you recognize that this is a role change. It's not more of the same. It's not a promotion. It's a sidestep into a different role, which you may not necessarily have the skills for, and you need to start developing enough skills to be well-rounded in leadership and architecture areas. It does require leadership skills, which a lot of people, when they find themselves in the role for the first time, have never focused on. So start to build up where you don't have that experience point, start allocating those experience points to the other traits to become a lot more well-rounded, and take comfort that others have been on this journey. Make sure that you sort of talk to other people who've been on this journey to understand how they've approached it, what has helped them, to understand what may actually help you. And recognize that there are many different resources out there, be it books, training courses. The hard question you'll have to ask yourself is, what do you want to start getting better at, and how do you have an opportunity to practice? And finally, is really about this mindset shift, about moving from maker to multiplier mode.